Hi there. I'd like to talk about the story behind the art today. I'd like to share the story behind one of my first Princess Leia portraits, and I'll show you what it's all about. So, for a long time, I've been making these portraits of Princess Leia in a pop art style. And some of you may recognize this style. It's based on or inspired by Patrick Nagel. Patrick Nagel is a famous pop artist from the 80s who had a great influence on the art of that time. And I've always been a fan. And so there was a time when I started doing portraits in vector art. And it occurred to me that vector art would be the perfect way to capture a portrait in a Patrick Nagel style. And so I worked on an idea. And of course, I wanted to pick something fun and something that I would like. So, of course, Star Wars was the theme. And Princess Leia, I felt like was the perfect 80s pop star. So I wanted to use her for that theme. Now, the other component that kind of brought me full circle was to look at Duran Duran. Now, Duran Duran is probably the first place I ever noticed Patrick Nagel's art, and so this Rio album was one that I had. I had the record, I had the cassette, I even had the CD, and I loved looking at the art, and it always kind of stood out to me because it was somewhere between kind of comic book art and glamour art. And so I was really intrigued by it. I didn't know till much later and learn about Patrick Nagel's process, but he did not use the computer in his work. His work was all handmade and printed, which was significant to me in the future. But at the time that I was kind of developing my portrait style, I realized, hey, I'm going to go for that in a vector style. So, first thing to do was to kind of set up and plan out my art. Now, that to me means drawing. And so I looked for pictures as reference to think of and see how I would show Princess Leia in her slave costume. And so I started sketching and drawing out what I saw. And that inspired this drawing for Princess Leia. And this is the first step in my process is to actually do a drawing and then kind of figure out the shapes, the lines, the detail that I want, kind of taking that photo but simplifying it into what I need for line art. And that becomes the template for my vector drawing because I draw directly on top of my pencil drawing uh, in vector art. So I bring it in as a separate layer, and then I use my vector drawing tools to recreate my sketch, but now with solid lines and shapes and colors. And that is where we get to this, which was the full complete version of this art done in that Rio style because I really did want to make that album cover, but with Princess Leia. And so I used similar font, similar lines, and detail to make the full and complete picture. But ultimately, I've disconnected that art from that Rio album and done it more like this, where it's a little more geometric and a little more abstract. And what I love about it is just the simplicity. There's something really beautiful to me about simple line art. Bold shapes, bold colors, and kind of that stark shadow, but bright white ink in that kind of geometric background. Something really cool about that. I think it just looks cool to my 80s kid eyes to see that. But it also feels like comic book art, which is really cool to me. And so when I draw in vector art, I get a lot of control over the lines. When I pencil draw, of course, I'm sketching. And so I'm kind of searching for that perfect line. Then when I bring it into Illustrator and I redraw it, that's when I get to perfect that line and that shape and create that silhouette that I'm really after. And so that's the fun part to me, is to figure out what to keep and what to abandon. So if you go back to the original sketch, you can see there's a lot more detail in there, especially thinking about the contours of her hair and her cheeks and her chin and so on, as I start to, like I said, look for that perfect line. But in the end, I only commit to a few to basically, find the simple line or the most important line to sell the shape. When it comes to doing glamour art, especially of women, you want to diminish some of the lines. If you do too many, especially around the eyes or around the nose or the cheeks, you can make them look really old and wrinkled. And so it's just kind of natural that you're going to limit the number of lines when drawing more of a glamorous portrait. And so emphasizing the very important and essential lines is important. So on her nose, for example, I'm not going to draw her entire nose. I'm going to minimize what I see and just focus on the very important shadow or contour shape to give the minimal detail to show you what's there without being so pronounced. Because if I did too much or too much of a dedicated line, believe me, it's going to look ugly. And then there are certain little tricks, highlights on the lips and a little bit of color on the eyelids for eyeshadow. And basically, this is from that Patrick Nagel style, this extra little outline, this extra little gray tone that links to the shadows. And to me, that's a residual from the printing process that he created back in the day, which I just love. And so I try to recreate that with the vector art as well. So that's where these portraits started. This was the very first one I ever did. And I keep doing more all the time just because it's fun. And I've branched out into other characters and I'll share those with you in the future. But hopefully you understand a little bit and get something out of that behind the scenes in my process. I don't know what your process is, what your final medium, your favorite medium is, whether it's paint or vector art or watercolor. You're going to have to develop a process so that you can do predictable, repeatable projects. And to me, that's where the fun in the art comes out, is creating that process that works and then repeating it again and again and again. All right, so that's me. Hopefully you're having fun with yours. Good luck. Let me see what it is and see how it turns out.